Alright, let's do it then. So, this is the first 5 chapters, so we'll just call it part 1 of Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, by our buddy Vladimir Lenin. Alright, so, the 5 chapters that we're going to be going over are concentration of production and monopolies, banks and their new role, the finance, capital, and finance oligarchy, export of capital, division of the world among the capitalist associations. And we'll be going over that in a little bit. So this is kind of the broadest overview, I guess. So keep this tucked in the back of your mind. But Lenin basically gives like, okay, if we had to say what's the briefest possible definition, he says the monopoly stage of capitalism. And this is an interesting thing to point out at the outset here, because we have to be reading this text in the historical context in which it was written, which is basically Lenin is updating and also adding on to a lot of Marx's original analysis of capitalism, which was mostly in Capital, in the first 3 volumes. And as we'll kind of get to in a second, there's some pretty key differences between like what you might call like old school capitalism, which is what Marx was analyzing, and this more modern version of it, which again Lenin characterizes primarily by the rise of monopolies. So and indeed, this is something that Marx did predict, right? It's something that he worked through in Capital, saying, well, hey, you know, everyone's, all these bourgeois economists are hyped about, like, free market competition. It's all about competition. Well, Marx is like, hello, the point of a competition is to win, and eventually some people will win. They will win this free market competition and become monopolies, because that's how you become most profitable. They're not going to be good sports about it. They're just going to basically destroy their competition and devour them until they are the only game left in town. That is how you win capitalism, basically. And so Lenin is pointing out in this text, and obviously there's a lot of data, contemporary data to, about the turn of the century when he was writing, that backs this claim up, that he points out that long gone are the days of competition between firms, and the new shtick is monopolies. That's the new thing. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Another quote that conveniently all 5 of these characteristics of imperialism, kind of like a general, what is imperialism? Okay, what do we mean by that in the Marxist-Leninist interpretation, not just the colloquial one, where you have to be invading someone, boots on the ground. Like, no, that may be a consequence of imperialism, but that is not like what imperialism is in this context. And coincidentally, these 5 things correlate to the first 5 chapters. So think of this first part 1 of imperialism, the what. What is imperialism? What is it? Let's look at why it's different from the previous forms of capitalism that existed prior to it, and also how did we get here. The second part will be more about the implications, I guess you could say. So we'll get to that next week, I guess. So, number 1, the concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies, which play a decisive role in economic life. Okay, number 1, there's monopolies everywhere. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Potentially, you interacted with a monopoly today, in fact. I would suggest that most of us might be interacting with a monopoly this very second through our internet service providers. There's a pretty good chance that your local internet service market is dominated by one player,
Or
or
your
at
water supply
most two
markets.
and maybe three if you're, I don't know, lucky.
Yeah.
So yeah,
No, water supply market be one company that will control the whole water supply.
yeah,
I think that I
exactly. It could
liked
be water, it could
about
be electricity. Yeah,
Lenin's writing more than um, Marx's writings that is more modern, right? Because
true. Yeah,
even the modern capitalists, when they try to use their monopoly abilities to start doing some imperialism here and there, they will lean back on Lenin's writing to base their imperialism. Even though it's obviously wasn't the point of him writing this book, but it shows you how precise his uh, um, uh, definition of imperialism, his stages of imperialism was, that even our modern um, capitalists use his analysis.
yeah, I think that's correct. And I think as well, a lot of his analysis is still extremely relevant in basically international affairs to this very day, right? I mean, we can look at this. It's not like totally comprehensive, and some things have certainly changed a bit, but it's mostly just aesthetically, or maybe again the outward appearance may have changed, but the fundamental mechanics are all pretty darn similar to what he was analyzing at the turn of the century.
Yeah, the name on paper had changed. Other than that, nothing basically
Yeah,
changed.
even the same four major players that are like back in his day, 120 years ago, were the dominant imperialist powers. Guess what? They're still the dominant imperialist powers, right? It's U.S., Germany, Great Britain, France. Those are still to this day the four biggest players on Earth. So now there are
Well,
new
yeah, and
players. There's China is now like, and I wouldn't go so far as to say imperialist necessarily, but they are much more of a major player in the global market, obviously.
yeah.
So again,
Even
yeah,
in his analysis, he talked about Japan a little bit, and you can see how the Japanese imperialism had grown since his time and developed in really obnoxious ways, I can say.
yeah. No, I think in a lot of countries since this was written have gone through this developmental process. It just it just might be that like in 1900 or so, other European nations hadn't quite gotten to this same level, but since then they have. Or if they haven't become the major big players, they've joined international monopolist associations such as NATO, the EU, World Bank, IMF, etc., etc. Loads and loads of countries participate in those organizations. So, anyways, yeah, I'll keep going here. So, number two, second characteristic, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation, on the basis of this finance capital, of a financial oligarchy. Number three, the export of capital, as distinguished from the export of commodities, acquires exceptional importance. Number four, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations, which is what I just mentioned, which share the world among themselves. And number five, the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed. Imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. So there, I think that might be the direct quote, but these are the five the whats of imperialism. If you're having a discussion and someone starts slinging around imperialism willy-nilly, they're probably using a liberal definition, I would assume, for most randos who don't really, they're not even getting close to this sort of level of analysis. And Yeah, this is
Oh
almost
my
like an
God, what
economic
do you
sphere.
mean by saying Japan is imperialist? Japan doesn't even have a former army. How dare you say Japan is imperialist?
Yeah, well, I'm sure they. I'm guessing the Japanese ruling class really do wish they had a military. But all right, let's. I guess we'll just go into it now. So, first part is all about monopolies, concentration of production. So, the enormous growth of industry and the remarkably rapid concentration of production in ever larger enterprises are one of the most characteristic features of capitalism. Here we no longer have competition between small and large, between technically developed and backward enterprises. We see here the monopolist throttling those who do not submit to them, to their yoke, and to their dictation. So again, I kind of preluded this a little bit a minute ago, but it bears repeating, right? That one of the biggest differences between when Marx was writing and when Lenin was writing is that monopolies have formed since then. And again, obviously, Marx knew what monopolies were. There were still some around. But by and large, the rule of thumb at that time was that competition was far more prevalent. And you basically had all these emerging industries and emerging commodity production, and over time, and as he does indicate, pretty rapidly in the grand scheme of things, these monopolies rapidly formed, and they had the large players win. And exactly what may have led to this company being a monopoly and then this one not being a monopoly, maybe they got absorbed, bought out, whatever, is kind of, it's a little bit random. Or maybe they were just the most ruthless. You know, whatever the actual reason might be, it doesn't really matter. It's just that one of the things Marx predicted again was that competition will eventually lead to there being a winner. Big surprise, because that's pretty much how every competition works. So, anyways, yeah, this is the first part we see in the formation of monopolies. Oh, that's right. I did put in the part with Marx. Okay, so half a century ago, when Marx was writing Capital, free competition appeared to be the overwhelming majority of economists to be a natural law. The facts show that differences between capitalist countries in the matter of protection of free trade only give rise to insignificant variations in the form of monopolies or in the moment of their appearance, and that the rise of monopolies as the result of the concentration of production is a general and fundamental rule of the present stage of development of capitalism. Okay, so sorry, I made this slide yesterday, so I totally forgot it's even in here. But yeah, no, this is the part I was referencing. Marx is working with a abstracted version of capitalism where he was sort of taking the assumptions of the original political economists verbatim and saying, okay, sure, let's assume that free market, free trade, and all that is the rule of the land, is the quote unquote natural law. He basically said, all right, I'm going to play by your rules and show you why you're wrong anyways, because that's what Marx was all about. But indeed, that's no longer the case at the turn of the century. You look around and you're like, well, there isn't really much competition because any small firm is not really competing with a monopoly. Like, not really. And they could easily get destroyed and bought out, like, with the blink of an eye, essentially. So it's not the same competition you'd expect from, like, kind of an idealized version of capitalism. All right, this is the next part. Translated into ordinary human language. This is a nice quote because it's translating some bourgeois economists' nonsense. But I mean, it's decent analysis. It's just he's using a lot of jargon, so that's why he prefaces with no ordinary human language, which is funny.
Um,
This,
just a quick question because I'm not a native English speaker. When he say bourgeois economist, he just means capitalist, right?
yeah, he's talking about yeah, they're economists in the sense that they analyze the economy, but they're bourgeois because
Mm-hmm.
they're basically just cheerleading for capitalists. They may not be
Yeah, yeah,
capitalists themselves, like literally, like they may not
yeah.
actually own
They are
capital, but
capital supporting.
yeah, they're just shills, and instead of actually being critical, they're just like singing the praises of capital, basically. That's what he means. So, okay. So he's going to break down what that guy was saying. So he says, this means that the development of capitalism has arrived at a stage when, although commodity production still reigns and continues to be regarded as the basis of economic life, it has in reality been undermined, and the bulk of the profits go to the geniuses of financial manipulation. At the basis of these manipulations and swindles lies socialized production. But the immense progress of mankind, which achieved this socialization, goes to benefit the speculators. We shall see later how on these grounds reactionary, petty bourgeois critics of capitalist imperialism dream of going back to free, peaceful, and honest competition. Has anyone heard of that criticism before? I know I have. This is often a refrain from mostly liberals, maybe even what they'll quote unquote say left-leaning liberals or the Democrats, basically. It's sort of like, oh, if only we didn't have monopolies, if only we had fair competition, if only the little guy had a chance and we could help them out through, I don't know, fucking tax breaks or some shit. That's 100%
Yeah,
petty
yeah,
bourgeois
but that's
perspective.
yeah, which still it's not saying anything. But if only won't help you in real life, you need to have an actual policy to enact action to help the little guy. You can't just say, "Oh, if only," and that's it.
Well, they do push for policies, and even when they do get passed, they don't end up helping the way they want to, right? I mean, tax breaks is actually a pretty decent example because that's something small, quote unquote, small business owners love, right? They love getting their taxes fucking cut. Well, yeah, it might help you out, fucking like jet ski dealership owner, but it's going to help out the monstrous, humongous corporations out way more. Um, in
Yeah,
fact,
exactly.
arguably they don't even care because they can dodge taxes much more easily. But yeah, it's just, again, fundamentally that type of criticism, which is fairly common amongst liberals, is reactionary. They want to go back to the old days of earnest competition, but which completely betrays a complete lack of understanding, right? Because if they had any shred of analysis, if they understood any like of the history of this stuff, they would realize that quote unquote honest competition leads to monopoly. That's what we had before. You're right. And it led to what we have now, which is shit and all monopolies. So why the fuck would you want to go back to that? It's not going to fix the problem. I mean, if
Exactly
anything, it
like
would
we
just
kept
recreate the
saying,
problems.
and exactly like Lenin and Marx were saying. It's like somebody wins. Somebody fucking wins. What are you expecting out of this? Like, if
It's
you want to go
basically
back to the
just
old
the
days,
it's basically just Einstein's definition of stupid, which is doing the same thing, the same process with the same conditions and expecting different results
Yeah.
because they are stupid. They are stupid with the definition of stupidness.
Yeah. That's what no theory does to a motherfucker. Unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. Get reading, bitches.
That's right. The other thing I guess I'll point out from this quote really quickly is a refrain that I know, we'll hear a lot from the actual leftists, which is an indictment of capitalism, which is that we have massively socialized production. And socialized production here is just referring to the commodity production, which has only been further socialized since the inception of capitalism, right? I mean, just think about, like, I don't know, any random object like nearby. Like I can look at my water bottle right now. Okay, it's a metal water bottle. It's got a plastic lid, and that's about it. It's got some paint on it, I guess. That I don't know exactly what the number is, of course, because unfortunately, because due to alienation. But I'm gonna wager that something like thousands of human beings contributed to the creation of this water bottle. I don't know exactly the number is, but someone had to get this metal out of the freaking ground, process it, refine it, work it into a water bottle shape. Same thing had to be done with the plastic to make the lid to it, and the straw and all that stuff. And then same deal with the paint. All those chemicals and shit had to be synthesized, and the raw materials had to get, like, pulled out of the earth. Just to make a simple water bottle, which is not the most complicated thing in the world, probably took a tremendous amount of people, and all working in concert, whether they know it or not, towards this end. And yet, the person who actually profited from the sale of this water bottle at some point was none of those people. It was some speculator or the capitalist of whoever the heck owns all this shit. And basically scaling that up, right? These quote unquote geniuses, right, of financial manipulation, they're not geniuses. The reason he puts that in quotes is because more often than not, the ones who do strike it rich off of speculation are just fucking lucky. That's always what it has been. No one can really predict the future accurately. There's a reason it's called speculation, is because you don't actually know if a certain investment is going to pan out or not. But eventually someone's going to guess correctly and get super crazy wealthy off of it, and a lot of other people will go fucking broke. I mean, it's pretty analogous to gambling, except you're gambling with obscene amounts of money that you are extracting from your workers. It's a pretty sweet deal, actually. Yeah, so if I was able to just guarantee that I could get $100 from each one of you in the freaking chat every day, and I could just gamble it every day, why wouldn't I do that? Because eventually I'm going to hit a big one and be like, oh heck yeah, I just made 1,000 times or whatever. But I don't have much risk in the matter, which is, by the way, another thing you'll hear capitalist apologists say all the time. It's a constant, such a dumb refrain, right? Oh, but the capitalists took risk, therefore they deserve what? Reward or profit or something. I don't give a fuck if you took risk, because guess what? It's called risk for a reason, because you could lose. Losing is not just a possibility. It is more probable to lose than it is to win. So yeah, that is an asinine argument, by the way. We can get onto that towards the end, but if you hear anyone be like, oh, they took risk, therefore they deserve reward, bullshit. Like, if I jump out a 3rd-story window and don't die, what am I supposed to be? Or I don't know. I took a monstrous risk, and I don't know. It's dumb. It's a stupid argument. Most of these quote-unquote geniuses who took a risk are not actually geniuses. They did take a stupid risk, and if they made it out alive, I guess good for them, but it's not because they're fucking smart, or they're mostly just lucky. Okay.
Yeah, and
Next
that
chapter.
doesn't that is can I
Yeah, yeah, good.
refer on this point a little bit because in our current station of being, like, risk isn't really a thing, right? Because most of the capitalists at this point, they calculate everything to a point where they don't really take any risk. They usually just go around, see which thing would give them more benefit and just go with it. They know that a lot of things will give them less benefit with more risk, and they go with it. Like they did that to themselves. Why would I, a normal human being, pay for their bailout when they took a stupid thing, even they when they knew that there was something else that was more beneficial for them and for the society.
Right. Because if their enterprise does fail, that doesn't mean that they're like broke all of a sudden. Like they still have a lot of money they can fall back on. But the enterprise is now gone, let's say, and that means all the workers are fucked because now they're out of a job. And unfortunately, most people are extremely close to poverty without a job. I think I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's something like 70% of households in America or something, if they lose their job for a month, would immediately become homeless or something. So yeah, I mean, yeah, the risk is socialized, right, and all the gains are privatized. That's how it's designed. Because guess what? The ones designed it have the most to gain. Big surprise, I suppose. All right, let's talk about some banks. This chapter is definitely a little bit of a slog to get through, but is interesting nonetheless. Okay, so let's talk about what banks are first of all, and then we'll get into their role specifically in the imperialist context. So the principal and primary function of banks is to serve as middlemen in the making of payments. In so doing, they transform inactive money capital into active, that is to say, into capital yielding a profit. They collect all kinds of money revenues and place them at the disposal of the capitalist class. The transformation of numerous modest middlemen into a handful of monopolists is one of the most fundamental processes in the growth of capitalism into capitalist imperialism. So, again, we're kind of analyzing this imperialist stuff in the context of moving from a older version of capitalism where these banks are just middlemen. They're just money movers. They just move money around. Right? If I put my savings, let's say it's like $1,000, whatever. If I take $1,000, put it in the bank because it's just in the bank. The bankers will take my $1,000 and go give it to a capitalist, or might be like in the form of a loan or whatnot. It could be an investment, and the idea is that they will take that money that's otherwise just sitting there and turn it into money capital, which the capitalist can use to make profit. In other words, more capital. And then I might, as just the user of the bank, I might see in a couple months that a little interest has formed, and now I have like $1,010 or something. Because I get a little, because I was letting them use my money in that time, they might give me a small slice that the capitalist procured in that time. So that's what traditionally banks are all about. But now we're looking at banks that have become monopolies. Basically, a whole bunch of little banks have all merged into these monstrously huge banks. And what are the ramifications of that? This new role that he speaks of. All right, so when a bank discounts a bill for a firm, opens their current account for for it, etc. These operations, taken separately, do not in the least diminish its independence, and the bank plays no other part than that of a modest middleman. So just quick note, this is the normal bank. This is like the previous versions of banks. They're just middlemen. They're pretty independent of what's happening in the capitalist sphere of production. They're just lending money and such, or opening accounts and day-to-day operations. Nothing too crazy. Okay, but when such operations are multiplied and become an established practice, when the bank collects in its own hands enormous amounts of capital, and when the running of a current account for a given firm enables the bank, and this is what happens, to obtain fuller and more detailed information about the economic position of its client, the result is that the industrial capitalist becomes more completely dependent on the bank. So this is actually what AMX and I were just mentioning, right? That capitalists don't have that much risk. Not only because the actual the downsides are all socialized and they don't have to worry about it too much, but even further to the point, they know way more than most people, right? And these banking monopolies have a lot of information about the economy because their clients are these humongous capitalist firms. And this becomes a very symbiotic relationship between the banks and the financial capitalists and the industrial capitalists, right? So just a quick note, right? So financial, if you're a bank, your business model is essentially lending money and, well, okay, so on one hand you store money for people, but you don't just let that money sit around. You lend it out to capitalists to use in their production and so forth. These are the industrial capitalists is what he's referring to, because they need money, right? They need money to get shit done, and sometimes they don't have the capital on hand to make investments in new technology, hire more workers, expand their operations to another country, state, nation, blah, blah, blah. It could be any sort of capital investment, but they need capital to do their thing. And where do they get it from? Well, they can get loans from banks, and investment from banks. And then the banks are getting money through essentially just interest, right? They're getting return on that investment. That's their entire operation. Now, what he's saying here is that where this business model might start out as modest middlemen, where they kind of take a slice, a small slice of the pie, eventually those little small slices in aggregate collects into a lot of fucking money. You know, shocker, banks have tons of money. I know, but this is what happens, as he does say. So, but yes, this relationship between the banks, which is sort of the finance realm, and the industrial capital, industrialists, they really become like fused at the hip. They rely on one another to make their money. The industrialists need capital to expand their operations and to be more competitive. And the banks, I mean, their entire business model is scraping money off the top of industrial production. So they're very much dependent on one another. Now, I mean, it says the industrial capitalist is more completely dependent on the bank, but I would even go one step further and say the bank also needs the industrialist as well. So yeah, that is something that has developed. All right, next. At the same time, a personal link-up, so to speak, is established between the banks and the biggest industrial and commercial enterprises. The merging of one with another through the acquisition of shares, through the appointment of bank directors to the supervisory boards and boards of directors of industrial and commercial enterprises, and vice versa. So again, same exact theme. We see, or what Lenin's seeing and analyzing, is that there is not just in the purely economic realm of money moving around, but literally in like the personnel. There's a lot of cross-pollination, if you might use that analogy, between the banks and industrial capitalists. So, you know, these huge capitalist enterprises and the bank board of directors, they might have like mostly the same people, right? They're governing the same exact enterprises. Yeah, same with commercial. So just another quick note for anyone who's not familiar. So industrial mostly refers to like actual production, is actual making of stuff. Commercial enterprise is more like, think of like Walmart. They're just selling shit. Now, industrial and commercial enterprises are two sides of the same coin, because you have to make the commodity, which is industrial, and then you have to sell the commodity, which is commercial. That's how you actually get money. That's how you actually get the profit, which is you have to produce it and then you have to realize it. So that's what he means by industrial and commercial. Just quick note. But then there's kind of this third sphere now, which is the banks, which is finance. You need money to make this machine work. In order to get capital, you need capital, and capital only expands by feeding off of labor. So, yes, obviously the whole engine runs on grinding workers into the fucking dust, of course. But at the biggest stage, there's like a big merging between all these industries. And then another kind of note here. All right, the 20th century marks the turning point from the old capitalism to the new, from the domination of capital in general to the domination of finance capital specifically. So basically we're saying, okay, so the certain sphere of capital, which is finance, is now reigning supreme, because it's really that ability to shuffle enormous amounts of money around, allows the whole machine to keep slogging forward and not just completely self-destruct. Okay, now we'll get to chapter 3, which is all about the finance capitalists and the consequential financial oligarchy. Any questions before I go forward? All right, let's do it. Prepared to be slightly pissed off, or maybe lots of pissed off, but you know, unfortunately this is what happens. We now have to describe how, under the general conditions of commodity production and private property, the business operations of capitalist monopolies inevitably lead to the domination of a financial oligarchy. Finance capital is capital controlled by banks, but employed by industrialists. This is this guy Hilferding. I know MX City, they hate German names or whatever. So, Hilferding. This is this person. So Lenin does, of course, can't let well enough be, so he sort of adds an additional element, which is specifically that this is all happening in the context of monopolies, right? So specifically, I'll just read it out. This definition is incomplete insofar as it is silent on one extremely important fact: on the increase of concentration of production and of capital to such an extent that concentration is leading and has led to monopoly. So, again, Lenin adding to this other person's definition that finance capital also is appearing in the context of monopolies. Okay, great. So that's what finance capital is. So again, think of it as the banks are the ones shuffling this money around. They actually control that capital. But the ones using it are the industrialists. They're the ones who actually put it into the production process to make more capital, which benefits the financiers and the industrialists. Okay. This is an interesting quote that I'm curious if there's any thoughts on this, but because this is another kind of bourgeois / liberal refrain I'm sure we've maybe run into. But anyways, we'll go over it real quick. So the democratization of the ownership of shares, from which the bourgeois sophists and opportunist so-called social democrats expect, or say they expect, the democratization of capital, the strengthening of the role and significance of small-scale production, is, in fact, one of the ways of increasing the power of financial oligarchy. A monopoly, once it is formed and controls billions, inevitably penetrates into every sphere of public life, regardless of the form of government or all other details. So two kind of separate quotes here, but let's go through them. So the first one, if you've ever heard the quote-unquote counter-argument of, oh, well, people can just buy shares in companies. Like, I could do that right now. I could open up some fucking stock trading site and buy stock in whatever company I want. And the so-called democratization of capital, they might say, oh, well, doesn't this like fix the problems of capitalism being like dominated by such a small minority? And Lenin says, no, you idiots. It actually strengthens that oligarchy, that small minority. And why is this the case? Well, clearly you only need we'll say a maximum of like 50% of the shares plus one. So in order to control the company. But now let's say that 20% of those shares are controlled by a bunch of completely disassociated parties. These small scale, it says small scale production, but like, let's just say these are random stock owners, day traders, whatever. They're not coordinating with one another. They're just individual parties who own small amounts of stock. Well, and add, let's just do a hypothetical. You add them all up, that's about 20% of the company. Okay, now, the controlling interest is, you only need like 40 or 30% of the company now to actually run everything, because you just need to be a plurality of all of the controlling parties. So anyways, but the point is basically that he's debunking this point.
If I remember correctly, before Elon Musk pitched to buy Twitter, Dorsey, I think, had 20 to 21%, if I'm not wrong, of the shares of the company, and he was effectively running the whole company because of this tactics of diversion the stock owners. And plus, you're even when you're doing that, you're basically still giving money to the finance oligarchy by basically just participating in the system, while they are gonna take your money through brokers or something like that, as they do.
Yeah. And I think, and honestly, the context that Lenin is writing in with the small scale producers, I think he's referring to like these small businesses, right? So like, what if we took it's sort of like the argument of, which you'll hear, again, maybe from like left-leaning liberals or whatnot, of like, oh, well, let's just break up the blank. Let's break up the banks. Let's break up the so-and-so industry, right? Let's make these huge producers and monopolies and break them into smaller ones. And Lenin's basically saying, no, that won't help, because the financial oligarchy, basically now it's like imagine like you're basically saying like, oh, I can't possibly eat this entire turkey. But if I chop that turkey into lots of bite-sized pieces, now I can eat them one at a time. And now you've actually successfully eaten the turkey. Maybe that's not the best analogy, but basically this quote-unquote democratization actually only accelerates the monopolization and the development of the oligarchy. It doesn't actually help anything. And I think, again, in the context of the text, I think he does basically say, the point of the matter is these banks are, and he didn't have this language because it's more modern, but he's basically pointing at the fact that these banks are a little too big to fail, right? I'm sure we've maybe encountered this before. if you know anything about the 2008 financial crisis, right? I mean, some of these banks were deemed simply too large, which again, they're just talking about. If you hear, oh, this so-and-so bank is too big to fail, that's probably a member of the financial oligarchy, right? That is what Lenin is talking about here. They're so enormous and they own so much, or even if they don't own, without them giving capital and giving loans out, the economy would fucking collapse. So they're not wrong. I mean, they are truly, they're too big to fail in the sense that if they do fail, like enormous sections of the economy will go under overnight. And of course, if you are just a servant of capital, that is not an option. So failure then is not an option. And then, yeah, the second quote, I guess, is a little more straightforward. I think it is pretty relatable. Again, for most of us, sort of what I talked about in the beginning. Like I said, it penetrates into every sphere of public life. Truly. I mean, you almost can't live a single day on this planet without interacting with some monopoly. Because they just get everywhere. And they're constantly trying to extract capital from you at all times. I mean, shit, think of like advertising. It's a fucking nightmare that we all try to escape, I'm sure. But you can't. It's hard to. Okay. Next portion. During periods of industrial boom, the profits of finance capital are immense, but during periods of depression, small and unsound businesses go out of existence, and the big banks acquire holdings in them by buying them up for a mere song, or participate in profitable schemes for their reconstruction and reorganization. Speculation in land. Okay, let me get to that second, actually. So first part, Lenin's talking about the boom-bust cycle here that we're familiar with, right? Capitalism is very prone to crises on a pretty regular schedule, and part of the growth process for this finance capital are these cycles of booming and busting. So during booming, it's great because, of course, money's flying around, everyone's investing like crazy, and presumably profits are quite nice, which the financiers do benefit from because they're the ones loaning a lot of this money. And then when you get to a depression, shit hits the fan, lots of small businesses go out of business, and, well, they don't go completely under, right? Because if you're the bank, a couple things might happen. So if you already, let's say you already loaned, you did like a small business loan and that small business gets nuked in the fucking depression, you get basically everything of theirs as a bank. You just get to acquire all that shit. And you can basically call in the loan, and even if you don't, a lot of banks don't do that necessarily, but even if they don't already have a loan out to these small businesses, if the small business is really struggling, they're looking to sell, okay, let's get out of Dodge, we're not making money, those the banks can go in there and, like he says, buy them up for a mere song. In other words, extremely cheaply. And then there you go. Now your bank owns part of this small business, and they can inject a lot of capital into what it calls, or what he's saying, are these profitable schemes of reconstruction, reorganization. All right, how many times have you seen examples of a small company that might actually be pretty cool, and they're doing something different in the market, they're doing things differently, maybe not just completely utterly focused on profit, but then in the second they get this huge injection of capital from an investor, maybe a big bank, suddenly the whole company gets reorganized, restructured. You might have, and then they might do layoffs, right? They might say, dude, you're spending way too much money on fucking labor. You can cut half your staff, make the other half work double time, and boom, you just fucking doubled your profits, right? I mean, this shit happens all the time. And as you might expect, it almost always devastates the working class, because pretty much any time a capitalist makes capital or like benefits from something, there's a pretty good chance that the workers are getting absolutely screwed at the exact same time. Speaking of that, I just put in this lovely sentence here because, again, even though Lenin did not have a crystal ball, we could maybe be fooled into thinking he did, because he mentions that speculation in land situated in the suburbs of rapidly growing big towns is a particularly profitable operation for finance capital. Yeah, banks own a fuck ton of land, right? So if you are like a first-time home buyer, I've had to actually point this out to friends of mine and they usually get very upset when you point it out, but it's true. When you're like, oh, so like you bought that house with cash, and they're like, no, of course not. Of course I got a mortgage, and you're like, well, then you don't own it, not yet. I mean, sure, there's a deed, but the bank owns it. They're letting you use it and slowly paying it off over time. And most people don't think this is totally weird, but it's like, yeah, banks own a shit ton of land on the planet. Lots. And it is speculative because banks can't know for sure if that property will actually sell, or if people want to use it, but they're going to buy it up nonetheless. So, yeah, I mean, land, mortgaging, and just landlording, basically in general, definitely a big pastime of the financiers out there. Which I know he didn't go into a ton of. There's like one paragraph on it, but I'm sure. I know for a fact there are more modern analyses of the 2008 financial crash. So look into that more if you're interested. All right, let's get to this part. It is characteristic of capitalism in general that the ownership of capital is separated from the application of capital to production, and that the money capital is separated from industrial or productive capital, and that the rentier who lives entirely on income obtained from money capital is separated from the entrepreneur, from all who are directly concerned with the management of capital. Imperialism, or the domination of finance capital, is that highest stage of capitalism in which this separation reaches vast proportions. The supremacy of finance capital over all other forms of capital means the predominance of the rentier and of the financial oligarchy. It means that a small number of financially powerful states stand out among all the rest. Yeah, so we're kind of scaling up here, right? So we're going from monopolies, and well, I guess it's also the next chapter a little bit, but these monopolies are growing in size, and they carve it all up until you've got basically entire states that are completely monopolized, and now they seek out other states to dominate, which I guess we'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, I mean, this is a little more of like a nitty-gritty definition compared to the opening slides I went over, which was much more nicely laid out. But yeah, we're basically talking about how so I'll just walk through it one at a time, right? So the ownership of capital is separated from the application of capital to production. So I think my interpretation of this is simply a pretty classic one, which is basically that the ownership of capital is It's owned by a capitalist. But they're separated from the application of capital production. They're not the ones actually going in there fucking making stuff, right? They just own it. They're not concerned with getting in there and using their own hands and own labor to make anything. And then, again, second, the money capital is separated from industrial or productive capital. So again, we're not... money capital is a little bit different from productive capital because... So industrial and productive capital, I think, is referring to mostly wages and like machinery, physical stuff that you actually use to make stuff. Money capital is more along the lines, I think, of lending. So again, this is like lending someone money so that they can use that money to make more money, and then you get interest in return, and that's how you also benefit. If that's what money capital is.
Yeah, and I think assets too could be classified as money capital.
Yeah, I think so. And then same separation with like a rentier. They're living off of income obtained from money capital, right? So they're rentiers / landlords. They do the absolute least of anybody in the equation. They are truly parasitic. They are completely separated from any sort of actual production or even just lending. They're literally just saying, I own something, therefore you pay me money because I own it and you need to use it. It's like the worst type of way to make money. And like he points out, he's basically saying like that is categorically different from entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that. I think that money capital in general is basically the same, right?
It is. Yeah.
I think the only difference between a landlord and a factory owner is that most likely the factory wants to produce something as necessary for human life as a home for a worker, right? Because a house, a place that you can stay in, is basically way more important than whatever the fuck you're producing in that factory.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what he's saying, actually. All right, so the rentier is living off of income from money capital. Like, they're just lending money or letting someone else use their money. I mean, you can replace money capital if you like for the landlord's specific version, right? I can read the sentence as the landlord who lives entirely off of income obtained from their land, right? That's rentier and money capital, landlord and land. It's exactly the same way of making money. They don't do anything. They just own stuff and they let people use it. And in return, they need a cut. And he's saying that is different from the entrepreneur who's actually using capital to make stuff. They need to actually engage with like markets a little bit more, and presumably there's, I mean, they're both, I guess, potentially risky endeavors if you want to go that way, but yeah, he's basically just saying, yeah, they're different. They're different spheres, different ways of making money with capital. And basically what he's saying, right, is that fast forward now through this process, imperialism is where these rentiers and the financial oligarchy have come out on top. Because ultimately, lending money and moving money around it just makes way fucking more money than production. And obviously that does involve like directly getting involved in production, as we saw earlier. So yeah, and then again, scaling up almost beyond like a national sphere, he's kind of hinting here that now we're going to start getting to like international, the international realm, where these powerful states, which have just crazy amounts of money, are able to dominate others. Yep. I guess go into that now. Why not? So he says, together, these four countries, of which he's referring to are the US, UK, France, and Germany, own nearly 80% of the world's finance capital. In one way or another, nearly the whole of the rest of the world is more or less the debtor and tributary to these international banker countries, these four pillars of world finance capital. So, again, we're kind of establishing this financial oligarchy, and then we can go right into the question of, like, well, where are they situated? Where is most of this capital coming from? Hey, it turns out it's basically almost all from these four countries. And I don't know what the exact number today is. Obviously, 120 years ago it was 80%. I'm sure it's a little bit more diversified now, but probably not much more, if I had to guess. I'd say it's probably still pretty much those four are still the main pillars of world finance capital. Okay, chapter 4.
Actually, not really. The biggest four banks in the world right now are Chinese banks. So I think that France specifically is way lower on the chart than China or Germany or even Japan maybe. But I don't think that separating France, Germany, and Italy is something that we should do in that context, because they are working in the same kind of thingy, right? Uh, there is no difference between
Yeah.
capital in France and capital in Italy, because there is no countrywide borders between them.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Because you also have the yeah, because I guess nowadays you'd probably look at it as from like a European Union as like a whole entity, right? Because like you said, that within the EU, I'm pretty sure like not only do people have pretty open like freedom of movement, but so does capital, and so does commodities. So yeah, you're probably right that you would probably need to change the way you do the analysis from just one, like just a couple European countries, because yeah, you're probably right that the EU is probably like a much bigger factor as a conglomeration of lots of different countries. And yeah, you're right. Obviously, when Lenin was writing, China was not anywhere near as relevant as they are today. So that probably would change the equation quite a bit. But I still think it's very fair to say that those four countries are still
Yeah,
four of the most wealthy
yeah,
countries on the
they
planet
are.
per capita. Like, I mean,
Like,
that's so the legacy of this
yeah,
imperialism obviously is still around. Obviously,
yeah, and at this point in time, um, China and the United States take around more than 30 to 31% of the world. Uh, what do how do you call it? Like financial, um, financial abilities, basically,
yeah. And
finance
I mean,
capital.
Lenin does write about the U.S. quite a bit in this text, which I don't know if I was surprised or not by that, because like, you know, I remember, I guess, learning in U.S. history class about like the era of monopolies, which is around when this was being written. And like, yeah, I mean, you do learn about like the oil, steel, and railroad and steamboat monopolies, the communication monopolies. And it's, I guess it's like, yeah, I guess the U.S. economy was like clearly a world player at this point in history. But even when Lenin was writing, it wasn't like, it still hadn't reached its peak of where it is now. Or, I mean, I know even
Let me
then, like
just
the U.S. is still like on the decline now. maybe, I don't know exactly what the peak of U.S. financial domination was, probably in the 70s or something, but yeah.
Yeah, let me just translate that. Why do you not translate it? Oh, shit. Just translate it. Why are you translating from Arabic to Arabic? Are you dumb? What is wrong with these fucking phones?
Yo, dog, I heard you like Arabic.
Wonders of capitalist technology. It has truly given us too much. We cannot overthrow it.
Yeah, Amex, just let us know when you can figure that out. I'll keep it going though. All right. Let's see. This is chapter 4, the export of capital. All right. Typical of the old capitalism, when free competition held undivided sway, was the export of goods. Typical of the latest stage of capitalism, when monopolies rule, is the export of capital. Now, I put in here as a refresher for everybody from our.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Let me just finish real quick, Amex.
Yeah.
Just as a refresher for everyone, right? This is from the Communist Manifesto, which went over before. But I wanted to kind of refresh our memory from what this old capitalism was like. And this is what Marx says, right? So the need of constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, and establish connections everywhere. So what Marx is talking about is, it is sort of the growth of capital and the domination of capital, because it needs to, and this is sort of what leads to the global market in the historical context, because capital has to keep expanding. It needs new markets to sell their stuff to, and also for raw materials and new labor and such. But again, in the old capitalism, so to speak, everything's centered around commodity production, or what he says here is the export of goods. All right, we need to make shit, and then we need to sell that shit to make money. That was the old capitalism. The new capitalism is different, because now we have monopolies. So competition is not as relevant as it once was. And now what we're focused on is exporting capital. So let's get into that. So Amex, go ahead and let us know what you found.
Okay, I found the share of the national wealth of the largest 10 9.4 and China with 9.1 of the world wealth. This is not money capital, this is wealth.
I missed
Of course,
the
it
first
is,
part of that. You weren't.
yeah.
Say it one more time.
The divulsion of wealth for the largest 10 countries is 78.7 in 2016, of course, where the US has 33.2 of the world wealth, followed by Japan at 9.1% of the world wealth.
And what was China at again?
China was at 9.1. Japan was 9.4. So
Okay. Okay, yeah. So I mean, definitely things have changed over the last 120 years. I would expect nothing less.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like I guess I said, you know, the legacy of this early imperialist activity is still very much alive and well. So It's still around, still happening and stuff. Okay. As long as capitalism remains what it is, surplus capital will be utilized not for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in a given country. This would mean a decline in profits for the capitalists, but for the purpose of increasing profits by exporting capital abroad to the less developed countries. The export of capital influences and greatly accelerates the development of capitalism in those countries to which it is exported. While, therefore, the export of capital may tend to a certain extent to arrest development in the capital exporting countries, it can only do so by expanding and deepening the further development of capitalism throughout the world. So this is kind of almost like the logical conclusion of what Marx observed in, or wrote about in the Communist Manifesto, that quote we just went over. And maybe a slightly different portion of that quote. Actually, let me see if I still have it open, because yeah, here, I'll read this other quote from the manifesto, right? It compels all nations, this is the bourgeoisie, it compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. Now, that was back from the Communist Manifesto, which was 50, 60 years before this was written. And now Lenin is living through a time where this is happening. They are exporting capital from the quote-unquote imperial core countries, where capitalism is much more highly developed. And indeed, it has developed into a monopoly stage. But now they have like crazy amounts of capital from monopoly level profits. And the next logical step for them in order to make more money is to export that capital to other countries that don't have as highly developed capitalist economies, because they basically need to, as the manifesto would suggest, spread their mode of production around the world on pain of extinction. So basically, they're not giving these countries a choice in the matter, to be clear. They're not saying, hey, do you guys want some money to do with what you will? No. This is, they come in, whether you like it or not, and start developing your country along capitalist lines. And now, what's the first part of this quote about? The money that's being imported to these countries for the purposes of accelerating their capitalism is not intended to raise their standard of living. That may be a side effect, in the sense of like there might be new technologies imported, and maybe wages rise slightly over time through class struggle primarily. It's not, believe me, it's not because the capitalists just are generous with their wages. No. It's mostly because the development of capitalism also means the intensification of class struggle, which occasionally, you know, the working class does receive concessions in the form of wage raises or maybe cutting the working day, etc. And that might lead to, and it does, I mean, it has historically led to marginal improvements in the standard of living of these countries. But when you compare it to the amount of wealth and resources and capital that is extracted, it is not even close. It is grossly disproportionate. So yeah, I mean, basically, that is what this export of capital is all about. It is also about making these less developed countries very reliant on the imperial core countries for capital to keep their economies going. And this is where, and I think we might get into this like chapter 6, so maybe next week more, but Indeed, what you'll find is when you get to the monopolist associations, so not just a single company, but now like entire groups of companies in these enormous banks, and I mean, Lenin did not know this at the time, but there would be a thing called the World Bank and the IMF that would be created. I don't know, maybe 40, 50 years after this was written or something. Whatever. I don't remember when it was founded. But basically, they specialize in doing exactly this sort of thing, is exporting capital from extremely wealthy nations to much less wealthy nations that need money to fucking survive and make their economies keep functioning. But those loans and from the IMF and the World Bank come with stipulations. They need to develop their economy and or maybe adopt policies and so forth that are incredibly beneficial to the imperialists, basically, and to these monopolist associations, because even the World Bank and the IMF, like, they still serve capital at the end of the day, right? They're not just giving money out because they are they have fuzzy warm feelings inside. Like, no. That is not their role. They're trying to develop capitalism throughout the world so that it is much more efficient to extract capital from the working classes of these less developed countries. So anyways, that's what this process is all about. It's definitely not out of any sort of goodwill, certainly. Okay, last chapter. The division of the world among the capitalist associations. Another one, it's a little bit shorter. Okay. Monopolist, capitalist associations, cartels, syndicates, and trusts first divided the home market among themselves and obtained more or less complete possession of the industry of their own country. But under capitalism, the home market is inevitably bound up with the foreign market. Capitalism long ago created a world market. As the export of capital increased, and as the foreign and colonial connections and spheres of influence of the big monopolist associations expanded in all ways, things naturally gravitated towards an international agreement among these associations and towards the formation of international cartels. So, again, this is where we're kind of getting to a little bit of a scaling up happening. So, the first thing that happens in the beginning is that these monopolies and trusts, cartels, syndicates, they carve up their own countries first, right? So, I mean, we were talking about like electrical power companies earlier. So maybe you have a couple, 3 or 4 big electrical power companies, maybe less, I don't know, but they'll basically come to an agreement of like, hey, you get this half of the country, I'll take this half of the country. We'll exploit our respective markets ruthlessly and make out like bandits. Sound good? Yep. Okay, cool. There you go. There's a cartel. So they do that on the national scale first. But after that's done, the next stage is to carve up the foreign market, aka the whole world, right? Because now we're exporting our capital around. A lot of this has to do with, obviously, the colonial legacy of all these countries. And naturally, the big monopolists want to get in on the action, right? Because, hell yeah, we have new markets to exploit. And naturally, what this will what ends up happening is that just like how they carved up their home countries, they can carve up the whole world. Oh, hey, you can take half of this country, I'll take the other half. Oh, and I'll throw in this other small country as a bargaining chip. Whatever. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's basically what happens, right? Because monopolies are typically like restrained to geographical areas, right? And that doesn't just happen naturally. I mean, maybe in some cases, but once they get to a big enough scale, they can literally just negotiate, right? Oh, hey, this is my territory, that's your territory. Let's keep it that way and choose not to compete against one another, because as soon as we start competing, we're both going to lose money, and neither of us want that. Okay. The capitalists divide the world, not only out of a particular malice, but because the degree of concentration which has been reached forces them to adopt this method in order to obtain profits. And they divide it in proportion to capital, and in proportion to strength, because there cannot be any other method of division under commodity production and capitalism. So, yeah, and pretty much the same spiel, more or less, right? They're not doing this, he says, out of malice, and I'll just add in for good measure, definitely not out of goodwill, just to be clear. But basically, yeah, they're becoming extremely concentrated, and in order to keep those profits humming along, they have to carve up the whole freaking world. And I think, yeah, it's basically saying that this giving up is done in proportion to their capital, right? So like the bigger players get more. It says in proportion to strength as well. That might be more along the lines of like the colonialism lens, right? So like the stronger country militarily, so like military as well as capital, just gets more.
Yeah, and you have
countries
to
that they can
remember that at
imperialize.
this point, the West Indies company was still operating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, like Britain
Another
had.
thing I would like to get your attention on is that at this point, when a new company emerges from the imperial core, they usually immediately carve their attention to the imperial periphery, for they are not able to compete in the imperial core. Well, this specific market wasn't wholly carved up in the imperial periphery yet. So this is a thing that you can see as a dalala, as a mark of this point, as they don't really compete anymore in the imperial core market because it's already so monopolized. They just go export themselves to the imperial periphery immediately.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I can give my perspective from taking this like entrepreneurship type course. I had to do it to just so I can get paid. Basically, it's part of the job. But part of the training for that was, they basically try and establish early on that one of the objectives for, good old entrepreneurship, right? Like, oh, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps if only you have a genius idea and a ruthless business acumen or whatever the fuck. I mean, they let you in very early on to say, hey, one of the best things that can happen to you if your business is successful is not to become an actual business. It's to get bought out by a bigger one. Because like you said, it's all been carved up before. I mean, it's a big club. You're not in it. So the best you can do is hope to get bought out by an existing monopoly and just get the bag.
Yeah,
and
just
leave.
like the story with Amazon and the with the diaper company, if you remember the story.
I don't know that one specifically. I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically, but
Basically, Amazon went into losses just to break up this company and buy it. I think the same story goes with Luxurica, I think its name, the glasses company that basically monopolized the whole market now.
oh yeah, Oh yeah, there's a lot of I mean, that's kind of, I think, what Elon did with Tesla as well, if I'm not mistaken. Like, Tesla for a long time was like wildly unprofitable. It was just hemorrhaging dollars, but essentially it was sustained through like pure hype and pure like speculation,
Yeah. No,
until it just,
the Luxottica, I think the name of the company, basically bought out the distributors and started taking money from the companies that want to distribute their sunglasses, and a bit by bit they started buying out glasses companies. So it's not the same company. No, it's the daughter companies that were bought out. It's not the same. I swear to God.
yeah. Oh yeah, I mean that's true. I didn't get too many quotes about that from the text, but here, I'm gonna look up that like flow chart or something of like all the food company monopolies. I don't know if anyone knows what I'm talking about and can find it faster than me.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's like this
10,
huge,
10, I
yeah,
think 10 companies
here,
that
yeah,
owns like 99% of the whole market in America.
yeah, and this is like just food, but here, I think, here we go.
Does anyone here know who owns Aquafina? I think it's
Uh,
Pepsi, but I'm not really sure.
yeah, let's search
Pretty
this
sure it's
picture.
Coke. I think it's Coke.
Coke? Yeah, one of these motherfuckers. Like,
Let's see. Let's look for
like
Aquafina on here.
you don't imagine.
I guess
You
I can
don't
just look it
imagine
up
how
real quick.
much these motherfuckers like had profited from Iraq, because basically they own the only clear water in the whole country, like Aquafina and a handful of companies. And if you start a water company in Iraq, what would happen is that
Oh,
you will
Pepsi.
get bought with double the capital that you started with. So with the correction is with the correction that says you can't start any new water companies, basically.
That seems very reasonable.
Yeah, yeah. So capitalist of you.
Yeah. Okay. So it's yeah. Aquafina is under PepsiCo. Amex.
See, I wasn't wrong. I never go wrong.
But yeah, that's it for the presentation. Yep, that's the last one. So let me get up the table of contents really quickly. So next week, the next 5 chapters are division of the world among the great powers, imperialism as a special stage of capitalism, parasitism. Why can't I say that? Parasitism and the decay of capitalism, critique of imperialism, and the place of imperialism in history. So, yeah, I guess, like I said, that's more of like, I guess you could say part 6 is a little bit the last part of what is imperialism, but I'll save that for next time. But then I guess we'll say the last 4 chapters really might be more of like the implications and like why is imperialism worthy of our attention, and also why is it distinguished from good old-fashioned capitalism.
Yeah.
So we'll get into more of that next time. But yeah, I guess we'll kind of do a little bit of discussion now. So if anyone's like, this is their first
Can
time
we
being
do
exposed to
some
this stuff.
discussion? Yeah. Can we discuss something that doesn't include imperialism for a bit? Because this is something that we have talked about before, and I have made some theory about, but I'm not sure that my analysis is correct. So I wanted to ask you guys about it. I think Dr. Hobbit was with us in the initial discussion, which was about like the use value of a thing, right? Because we know value is the labor necessary to produce a thing, right? But then we had a Turkish TikToker that just swing his belly around and he gets millions of views, right? And he gets rich out of that, which is right. He have put some labor into that, but it's not equivocal to the to the labor necessary to get this rich, right? So with that, I have theorized that it's because of its used labor, because as long as the infrastructure necessary to view the video still there, theoretically you can use this video infinite amount of times, or at least as much as 7 billion times, right? So here in the new age of technology that we have, which is the internet, something that Lenin and Marx and others didn't theorize really about, which is the infinite use of a product, because at their time there was limited uses for the product if there was more than one use, right? So what do you think about that?
Makes sense to me. I mean, when you have infinite use value, that kind of the same general principles still apply, but it does fundamentally change the equation in a sense, because it already exists. So in a way, you're getting fresh. It's on the person consuming it, because the person making it only ever had to make it once. And then, although the means of production in that case is the infrastructure that is basically making it possible to...
Well, yeah, but the thing is that
Well, can you
there is
explain really
millions
quickly,
of
like,
videos.
you said it was like a Turkish, what, TikToker or something?
A Turkish
Basically,
TikToker that just will shake his belly around. This is it.
And how does he actually make money?
This was
Where's the money coming
from sponsors, of course. Not from sponsors, from ads that appear
right,
on his
just
videos, and
ad space.
yeah, basically. So the actual value of the video isn't really that high, because the infrastructure isn't all built upon this singular video, right? There is millions of TikToks that get uploaded every day. So if you divide it, you might get like less than a penny for a video as a cost of keeping up the infrastructure. So yeah, it was kind of complicated to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it is a difficult thing to apply. Like, I guess what you're saying is like applying the labor theory of value to this can get weird. I mean, ultimately, I think
it does make sense. It does make sense when you apply the labor theory of value to it.
I think so.
Because there is the use value that will always be there, right? The use value of this video is the time people spend watching it, right?
That's what I was going to
which
say.
is too high.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the fact that there's so many eyeballs on this thing that it becomes extremely useful as advertising space.
Yeah.
So even though it didn't take a lot of labor to do, it's still extraordinarily useful. But like, I think like Dr. Hobbits, or maybe whoever said it, but what you also indicated is that like the fact that there's an entire infrastructure that allows millions of eyeballs to get on to this one TikTok is also a huge part of the equation. So there's
Yeah,
like
in
a
a
ton of
sense.
value that's not just purely from labor, or at
Yeah,
least
in a,
not that TikToker's
Yeah.
labor. It's from other people's labor.
yeah, in a sense, the
Yeah. Well,
internet
the thing
itself
is
is the
that
means of production at that point.
Yeah.
yeah, which gets really difficult because like who specifically is paying for what, right? When you get to this question, like you know that there must be somebody who's paying for the means of production. But when you think about it, really, we're all paying our fair share, even maybe even specifically way more than our fair share by buying internet subscription. Because if you divide it onto like the world population or that uses internet or something like that, you would need like $5 to $6 per person to keep up the whole infrastructure. Like, and the value of this would be way more than the value of another thing. Like, as long as you can keep eyeballs looking at it, its value will skyrocket.
Yeah, and that's the other thing,
Sorry,
I
its use
guess.
value will skyrocket.
Well, and that's where I would also be like, this is why you don't just look at use value. You have to look at exchange value too. Like the usefulness of
Yeah.
that TikTok is, like you said, it's just a short video. I don't care what he was doing in it, but it can't possibly be that useful. But it
Yeah.
does have an extremely high exchange value due to the fact that it has so many people watching it. And so now it becomes very lucrative advertising space.
Yeah. It has more like social value than actual value.
Well, yeah, I mean, value itself is a social relation, right? The only reason anything has value is because different people can look at it and be like, ah, yes, this is valuable because of X, Y, and Z. I mean, usually you can take anything that has some value, you can break it into, it has a use value, so there's some way I can use this, and it has some exchange value, which just means I can exchange this thing for another thing.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, like, the labor theory of value haven't given us up till yet, because we have some things with theoretically infinite use value, and the labor theory of value are still applying to them, which is very amusing to me, that a theory that old still stands its ground. Like you have theories like the Einstein theory of gravity that still doesn't apply to everything. The same with a lot of other theories that we base our worldview around. But the labor theory of value specifically cultivate basically everything. Yeah, because when I first started looking into this issue, like the person who brought up this thing, like brought it up as a joke, basically. But when I first started looking into this thing, like what is the value of somebody throwing his belly around, you know? I thought that, oh my God, I'm gonna go into a dilemma and I'm not gonna be able to materially observe on this. But labor theory of value never fails anyone.
All right. Anybody else have any comments, questions, concerns about imperialism stuff? I'm curious if anyone's like I'm gonna assume at least a few of you are the mythical baby leftists who haven't read much theory. Maybe didn't even read this book, filthy cheaters.
Okay, you got me there. You got me there.
I have my concerns about imperialism. That just because I live in the third world doesn't really apply to this group, though.
Yeah, you're gonna have to take that up with HR. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, up till now, I really assumed that imperialism was just dominant military power, or like, and all were engaged in imperialism in the Middle East, which was like, which to my knowledge at the time was, hey, we're bombing Iraq or something.
Iraq, your mother. Don't say that again. Say it correctly or not, or don't say it.
Iraq. Apologies.
Yes. Good job.
Sorry, my Arabic isn't all that good.
Yeah. So, let me give you some things about imperialism, right? So there is three kinds of definitions for imperialism. There is the third worldist following school of imperialism, which says like any cultural, economic, or the first one was the first definition of imperialism that was in the colonial era was basically army dominance over a region. That is what they were concerned of when they were talking about imperialism.
Right.
Then there was
I
the
would
Lenin.
also comment really quickly that definition, technically you could even go as far back as like the fucking Romans. Because it was an empire. Like they were doing like old school imperialism, which was just literally military conquest.
Yeah, this was the dominant imperialism. Then Lenin codified it into what we call imperialism in a Leninist sense, which is money imperialism, basically financial and capital imperialism.
Yep.
And then there was the third world definition, which said not only economic domination over a region, but militant domination over a region and cultural domination over a region. So that would include in the third world definition, that would include McDonald's being in South Korea, for example. This is cultural domination. Therefore, this is imperialism, right?
Sorry, I wasn't really thinking all that straight because I was just playing Monster Hunter. Apologies.
No worries. Yeah. So these are the main three definitions. We usually go with the Leninist definition because it's more codified, but you can go to the third worldist definition if you want any time, because it will apply, because one of the main things in the third worldist definition is the Leninist definition.
Yeah. And I kind of mentioned this a little bit in the presentation, right? But like the process of exporting capital is not as mundane as it sounds, right? It's like I said, because that capital has so many strings attached, and just because you're exporting capital to some other country doesn't mean like they get to keep it. It's not theirs to use. It still belongs to the monopolists. So that usually historically has happened through coercion or outright aggression militarily. That has been the like method of exporting capital and establishing, or and dominating another country's economy to serve your needs as opposed to their needs.
Well, I would say the most mundane use of imperialism in our current era is the Chinese kind of imperialism, because it's basically beneficial to all parties, and at the same time, it is like not forced onto people, right? It's like it's the as my friend put it, the kind of imperialism that you wish for.
Yeah.
It almost does seem a bit strange to actively wish for imperialism from China, but
Yeah, it is because this thing was like if you're gonna choose between imperialisms, the Chinese one is the best one to choose. To choose. Nobody's actively going out of their way to say I want imperialism in my country.
Yeah, and I guess if we look at like our checklist here, if we want to try to analyze, like, okay, is China doing some imperialism? So are there monopolies? Yeah, I'm pretty sure China has lots of monopolies. Some of them are even state. They're even they even have state controlled monopolies, right?
Yeah.
And then merging of bank capital and industrial capital. I don't know if I know the details, but that seems very reasonable to me. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Then export of capital, no doubt. They're doing a lot of exporting.
Yeah.
But like AMX said, it's usually the more mundane and like they're building infrastructure type export of capital. And there's also the additional factor of a lot of times China is actually just giving gifts and they're or in other words, they're forgiving the loan, right? They're basically saying, oh, well, we're going to build y'all like a port or something. But we're going to, once it's finished, we don't expect you to pay it back. We're going to forgive. We're just going to let you keep it. It's all good. Because ultimately, China has done the math, so to speak, that it doesn't matter if it gets paid off for them. It still benefits them long term, and that's good enough. Like having, what's it called? Like agreeable relationships with these other countries is worth it to them. That is what they're purchasing, if you think of it that way.
Yeah. Or you can say that they are purchasing a port to get their money in the country, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I would even say, I mean, China in that sense might be operating a little bit more in what Lenin keeps calling the old school capitalism, right? They're looking for markets that they can export their goods to, because China still has a production heavy economy. I know they're sort of gradually transitioning to more of a consumerist economy, but that's still very gradual. I think it'd be fair to say they still do a tremendous amount of the world's production at this time, commodity production. And because of that reality, they need to export those goods to realize profits and such.
Profits.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
And so it does make sense for them to invest in infrastructure somewhere else where it literally makes it easier to import their goods and get money from them, even if they don't like extract money from these governments, basically, because they do want to maintain friendships and good relations, of course.
Yeah.
With the additional benefit
that China do, another thing that China do is that they, instead of making you pay the loans, they extract the profit themselves, which makes it way easier to everyone. Because if I'm gonna extract the profit and you're not gonna pay me, then you're just gonna have more economic flow to your country without having to pay for a port or something like that,
Yeah.
As I told you, it's more beneficial to everyone than any other kind of imperialism.
Right. Yeah, and I would say, I guess, for the China question, like the last two characteristics of are a little more tough for me to answer, at least, because I know,
Which ones?
like the international monopolist capitalist associations, because China's definitely a member of
Yeah.
some of those, but not all of them, like the U.S. is, for example. And indeed, like
Yeah.
some of the largest cooperations, like the U.S. is, at least vocally or outwardly, they're like, oh, we want to compete with China, blah blah blah. It's like, yeah, I mean,
Meanwhile, I'm in the mindset of like, why bother competing?
yeah, and a lot of times they don't really compete either. Like it literally is just rhetoric. I think they know they have to do business in
Well, the
China
thing
whether they
is
like
that
it or not.
China is definitely, what we can say is that China is definitely imperialist, right? But that doesn't mean that they are. That doesn't mean necessarily that they are the bad guys here, because imperialism is just a tool, you know. Imperialism is just a tool,
Well,
and
it's
as
also
the
a stage. Like
trajectory.
I would also mention, it is a stage of capitalist development, right? Like, I mean, I think it's pretty. I think I mostly understand China's situation is like, essentially they did some reformism to say, okay, we're gonna let some capital in under the like directorship of the Communist Party, which is pretty unique, but nonetheless, they're basically like, okay, we need some capital in the country in order to like develop our economy, because if we're just completely blockaded and embargoed by the other imperialist powers, we're gonna fucking die. We're gonna starve to death. So we need to let some capital in and let capitalism do its thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because capitalism in China has developed so rapidly, they have gotten to a stage where they have enough capital now that they can export it, and they are exporting it. And so yeah, I think they have reached an imperialist stage of development. I don't think that's very controversial. Well, it is.
Well,
but
I think that a lot of people, a lot of people would argue with you, saying like, "Hey, China is doing
imperialism in
capitalism, capitalism right now. Therefore, capitalism is superior because the only standing quote-unquote socialist country is doing capitalism." In which the answer to that would be that this is completely utter bullshit, and the only reason why China had to go through the capitalist route is the technological embargo. Right now, as China is one of the greatest economies on this planet, China is going through a technological embargo. I don't know if you have heard about the Four-Chip Alliance.
Yeah,
have you?
I did, yeah.
It's an alliance between America, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan to basically keep China at least 10 years behind technologically. Like the largest, the best processor at this point, a graphic processor at this point is the A100. And when it was first introduced, America had put regulation on it that say basically you can't sell it to any Chinese affiliate until 10 years after the first production of it. And we're nearing on the end of these 10 years, and there is a new processor that is on the way of going out, which is the H100, and America is about to put the same regulation onto it, so to keep China behind technologically, so China cannot thrive like other countries. And this is the thing, like it is socialism under siege in all cases, because if you're under siege in any way, you are under siege. It doesn't matter. The Soviet Union had way bigger of a siege for actually nuclear threat every day on their back doors, but that doesn't mean that China isn't under siege, for China has lesser problems. If China let out the technological race to America at this point, what would happen is that China will go behind and behind and will fail, just like how the Soviet Union failed before. The best course of action for China right now is to keep trying to compete for the new technology and or actually occupying Taiwan, which would be hard, because the current American plans in Taiwan, that they will blow up the chips factory as soon as China gets into Taiwan, to not let China control them. Like they are going out of their way to blow it up just to stop China from getting it.
I think I have heard that before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the
And the
you're talking
other-
about like in the case where China like does
Surprising.
invade Taiwan, that they'll just like burn everything down before they get a chance to control it.
Yeah, and another thing, that they will kill all the engineers that work in it, because in the chips engineering field, a skilled worker that's been working in the chip factory for like 10 years is way more powerful than any new engineer. So the engineers of Taiwan right now are considered the best in the world. Like they sell. The chips are counted as how 1,000 processors for how many I think millimeters. The best that China can buy is 14 millimeter for 1,000, and the best that China can produce is 1,000 is 1,000 transistors for 10 millimeters, while the Taiwanese are working on 1,000 for 3 millimeters, which is a huge difference in size.
Which brings me to, at least for me, the most annoying thing in the China discussion domestically in the US is people are always going on about, oh, well, China's stealing technology, like corporate espionage. It's like, first of all, as a socialist, as a country that fundamentally, on many levels, believes in the concepts of socialism, they don't believe in copyright to begin with. So the idea that a country with that perspective would honor the copyrights of countries they're effectively at economic war with is absurd. Like, they should be grabbing up all
Like,
the
okay.
useful...
No, let's say that, okay, your argument is 1,000,000,000% valid. Why don't you criticize America for doing the same thing? America does the same thing via actually spying on corporate officials in Germany, France, and Britain to get ahead of them in the stock market. Why don't you criticize America for the same things?
Yeah, exactly. That's my issue with people who point the finger at China for doing the same thing, when America has a long history of doing, like, that's all of American corporate development is basically buying and or taking credit for originally taxpayer-funded research.
Yeah, and don't forget that the framework for the internet that America developed was originally started in the Soviet Union as a part of a controlled economy. They developed something just like the internet that they tried to use to calculate the economy without much of problems, and they failed to do that because of American control over producing processors, and then the Americans copied that idea to start basically the internet.
Come on, AMX. We all know that Al Gore invented the internet in 1995.
Oh yeah, on his own.
Yep.
Yeah, the idea that I'm talking about was created in 1962, I think, by a Soviet professor.
Typical Americans, stealing credit from the Soviets.
Yeah.
And in the case of the space race, only declaring the race won when we finally actually accomplished something.
Yeah.
And also
Well,
disregarding any further achievement.
Mhm. Well, the only thing that made America land on the moon are basically two things: research from the Soviet that was basically free for all, and Nazi scientists. So they stole both. That's why they won.
Also, I think we can keep discussing, but I'm gonna stop the recording there for now.
Yeah.